Hello everyone, this is Professor Bopper, and today, let's do a quick video looking at Grey Heritage Faded Vision, a turn-based tactics game developed in SRPG Studio by B-Train Studios. For transparency's sake, I was given an early review copy of the game way back in November 2022, but because of my schedule and not, doing this as a full-time job, it was hard to find the time to talk about the game until now. So that I don't bury the lead too much, Grey Heritage is my favorite SRPG studio game that I've played, and one of my favorite tactics games that I've played in the last couple of years. A big part of that is because Grey Heritage is one of those rare SRPGs that's highly curated. At a very brisk 12 to 15 hours, the game is short for its genre, and all of its maps give the player specific challenges with specific setups that need to be overcome. For example, there's a prison break chapter where the player army is broken up into 3 different groups. One group is busy breaking out of the prison, one group is clearing out the enemies outside the prison to clear an escape route, and the third is using subterfuge to flip open the doors in the prison. There are other examples, like a map where you have a group broken off to destroy enemy supply lines, and the effect of this is that, while there's limited choice for unit formation and builds, most maps are memorable. Some are duds. There is a mid-game defense map that can be easily cleared without attacking a single enemy, something of a speciality on this channel, but for the most part, the maps work really well. In order to make these maps work as well as they do, the game doesn't feature permadeath, which for some players may be a turnoff as the feature is sometimes seen as sacrosanct in the genre. With only a small cast of playable characters and hyper-curated tasks, the absence of permadeath never felt like a flaw. If anything, its removal keeps the game from becoming a frustrating slog. The word slog is one worth circling for some players, however. Getting into SRPG studio games has an adjustment period. The engine opens up development to so many young indie designers, but it's also not the prettiest nor smoothest engine on the player end. Controls can be a little clunky on anything other than mouse, and the animations can be stiff and generic. None of this takes away from the gameplay design, which is frequently exemplary, or the writing, which floats between serviceable and interesting, but never overstays its welcome. One area that might off-put potential players is the hit rates. Grey Heritage runs on a single RN system where the battle forecast numbers are what you actually get. The decision to use one RN isn't a surprise given that the primary influence for B-Train was the Kaga Fire Emblem games and Saga games. The hit rates feel very similar to Berwick Saga. It's not uncommon to have back and forth with the enemy where everyone is missing every attack. It's the only design decision that I don't really like because it often serves to slow the game down. Not by much, but it may be a deal breaker for some players. However, there are ways to mitigate this. Characters have many powerful skills. There are skills like Astra that give you more attacks, or positional skills that give hit and avoid bonuses, and all these are available right from the beginning. Because of the game's short length and curated design, characters have complete builds from the moment they join. Recent Fire Emblem games, for example, have increasingly focused on building units, and oftentimes games with a ton of build options end up with the player funneling most characters down similar paths because not every option is equally useful. By stacking the deck for the player's army, you end up having to take advantage of all the various tools you have, from dances to ballistas to siege tomes and positional skills, and sometimes you have to just find the best option with suboptimal options. It's a lot more fun than dumping Cantor on everyone or dragging 10 people through Brigand, and it's a great return to old-school army compositions in games like Genealogy of the Holy War and Thracia 776. Now, before I get too long-winded, I'm going to cut the review here, because I had an opportunity to discuss Grey Heritage with its developer, B-Train. So, roll the tape. Alright, so hello everybody. I guess it's weird saying that at like the 6 or 7 or 8 minute mark of a video because everyone's already been hearing from me. But today I am joined by the developer of Grey Heritage, B-Train. How you doing today?
Hey man, I'm doing great. It's awesome to be on the channel. I've been a long-time viewer for a while, man.
And I'm glad you decided to to join for this because it's been something that we've been trying to do for a while. Because Grey Heritage first released, was it January?
Early December.
So it's been this has been a long time making, and I'm glad we could finally make it happen. But we're here. I'm just going to be asking you a few questions about Gray Heritage's design, just so that we can give viewers out there kind of a better picture of what this game is like. Because as we've already talked about in the first few minutes of this video, or not we, but I have, is that I'm a really big fan of this game. I enjoy Gray Heritage a ton, but instead of just me yammering on endlessly, I want to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about your game. So,
No, I really appreciate it. Like, I'm glad that you like the game a lot.
it's really good. And one of the things that, like, you know, whenever I go into a RPG, whether it's a big JRPG, big Western action adventure RPG, strategy RPG, tactics game, whatever it may be, one of the big things that always, I don't want to say off-puts me, but makes it difficult to finish games is length. And one of the things that you had mentioned early on when the game was coming out was that it's very short. I beat the game in about 13, 14 hours. I don't have the exact number up. I don't feel like pulling up Steam right now. But
Yeah, no worries. It's generally people say 10 to 15 hours.
And I was reading all the story, going to houses, doing all that. And also probably had like a few times of like leaving the game, just kind of running in the background as I went to grab stuff. But overall, for an RPG and for a tactics game, it was really short. And to me, that was a big selling point. A lot of games, especially indie games by younger or newer developers, they want to be epic. They want to compete with the big epic games. They want to be the biggest, grandest video game imaginable. And so I'm just curious what made you settle on telling a shorter story with a shorter game?
Yeah, so something I try to keep in mind is that as much as I love like big SRPGs like Berwick Saga or Genealogy, Thracia, Three House, things like that, I do try to keep in mind that the development team of those games are much bigger than just myself, because I kind of work on Gray Heritage alone. So that's something that I keep in mind. And I also wanted to keep the length shorter, but a more polished experience, because the longer the game is, the much more longer time it takes to polish the game. And if I was the main QA for my game, so that's something I have to keep in mind. So with all of that in mind, I thought the smarter thing to do was to make the game 10 to 15 hours, which a lot of the early Fire Emblem game was like that. I used Sacred Stones as a pretty good example. It took me about like 10 to 20 hours to beat Sacred Stones, and I wanted to aim for that length. I thought that was a very good basis for an indie game developer. And for people who didn't know, they worked on Sacred Stones while they were working on Path of Radiance. So, you know, they did things like they reused assets. It was a much smaller team to work on this side game, but like it was still a very memorable and fun experience. And that's something I look for in development cycles of games, so I could use it for my own. And that's kind of like a big reason why I went for 10 to 15 hours.
This is one of the common criticisms of Sacred Stones, is that I think a lot of times its length does get criticized for being too short. But specifically because a lot of the just stuff that you have to do in Sacred Stones, whether it's like the legendary weapons or the end game, it just feels like you don't get a lot of time to really use it. And one of the things I really liked about Gray Heritage was that there's not anything where I felt like, wow, this really needed to be more here so that I could actually use the stuff that I was given. I never felt locked out or having to rush to engage with everything that the game had, which is something that I really like about it. And it also, like, short length, and there's not any procedural stuff. There's nothing like the Tower of Volney, nothing that feels like padding. It is very much all killer, no filler. Yeah. And one of the things that I really liked about the game in that sense is that every map is super curated around a specific
Mhm.
experience. The footage we actually have playing right now is Chapter 6, which is my favorite chapter in the game, or one of my favorite chapters in the game. There are ones that are more complex than this, where you'll have your armies broken up into a bunch of different smaller subgroups, and you have to like run around and complete different objectives with different parties, which is pretty unique. A lot of Fire Emblem games, a lot of tactics games, SRPGs really have like an open-ended approach. Like you decide how you start the map. Whereas here, there's not a whole lot of choice with that. You have to deal with problems that are given to you by the game. So what was the inspiration for that? Because that is something we just don't see a ton of in the genre.
Yeah. So this kind of came up during development where I was making a map, but the original Chapter 6 I've had like a long time ago, it was like very Fire Emblem-y. It was like one or two group, and they kind of just go through one hallway, and I just didn't really find it that fun. So I redesigned Chapter 6 to be more multiple small groups, and I found it to be really fun when I did it that way. And after a while, my philosophy for game design for Grey Heritage Faded Vision was I wanted to make 2 or 3 small chapters playing simultaneously, but they also like interact with each other in small ways. And I felt like that makes the chapter much more memorable, and it's not something you get very often in Fire Emblem. And I feel like with the SRPG genre, you can do a lot more. So that was something that I kind of came up with as I was designing my chapters. And I feel like when you have like this big map, like it's really helpful to see just a bunch of small groups slowly coming together. Like you see all this game plan that you're doing like slowly combined into like one main objective, and I just found that really fun. Um, but yeah, I'm glad you liked that one. That's actually
Yeah.
one of my favorites as well.
I like that description though of multiple maps like happening simultaneously at the same time, because you've spoken to me very briefly about like how much you love Kaga and Kaga's Fire Emblem games and the Kaga Saga games, and one of the things that people often say about Genealogy: The Holy War is that it's not really like one big map. It's a bunch of small maps where you complete, here's an objective, then you complete that, then you're on to the next one. And what I really like is that this is sort of like an advancement of that idea, where instead of it going from small map to small map to small map in a big space, it's multiple small maps happening at the same time. And I don't know, I just really think that's I like that description of it, because you see, especially like from the Genealogy perspective, you see a lot of Kaga influence in this game, which for some players will be a major red flag, and for others that will be really exciting.
Unfortunately, that's just who I am. I'm just a big Kaga fan. I can't hide that from my
you
own
can't.
designs,
But what is it about Kaga's design, or which Kaga games was it that you like had the most in mind when you were having issues? Developing and going through the creative struggle. What was a Kaga game or Kaga idea that you were like returning to for like inspiration?
Yeah. So, one of my favorite game is Thracia 776. I feel like Thracia is one of those games that does really well with how interesting map designs are. There is some mechanics that I can see people being like, all right, this is a red flag, heels missing or something. But those are usually mechanic based. But if we're talking about pure map design, Thracia is a very good example. I also like looking at Mystery of the Emblem a lot. Some of the combat mechanic are, I guess, like old school or like outdated compared to the Fire Emblem series. But the map design, like, it's very solid in my opinion, and I always like looking at those games as inspiration whenever I'm stuck, or whenever I'm like, oh man, this chapter is not fun, like what can I do to make this fun. I always look at those maps.
Yeah, and there's a lot of very memorable maps in Thracia. And there are memorable maps here too. And I think like searching for that identity for each map. There's not a map here that feels like, oh, we're just putting this here because we need an extra chapter. It's all very carefully curated, and part of that curation, I think, comes at a sacrifice. I think two big sacrifices this game makes for its vision, and I use the word sacrifice just because there's some players that are not gonna like this. The first is the removal of permadeath. To make everything as controlled and as curated as it is, you kind of have to know what's there, and so there's no permadeath. And I think for some players that will be like, okay, this game's not hardcore, it's not difficult, it's because unfortunately the Fire Emblem series decided to call no permadeath casual mode, which I will assure everybody that like this is not the hardest game ever, but it's certainly not. You can't turn your brain off and win. I've actually sped through a game over that I got on screen during this footage. Don't look. So why remove permadeath? Was that something that came later in design? Was that something that you kind of started out already knowing? And what was the basis for that decision?
Yeah. So I looked at permadeath. Well, I looked at the Fire Emblem series first, and like whether I like it or not. I like permadeath the most when there is a big cast of characters. So, Shadow Dragon, Thracia, Binding Blade is a good example. Games like that where the choices you make when a character dies is the fun part of permadeath. You're like, okay, do I want to keep going? Do I want to train this other unit I got? That there's a lot more like thought put into when a character dies. But when you have a small roster, which my game only has 11 playable characters, if a character dies, I say 90% of the time you're probably just gonna restart, and I feel like that just kind of gets annoying in that sense because you don't really have that like internal debate whether you want to keep going or not. Like if you lose Dustin, you're probably gonna restart. If you lose Linda, you're probably gonna restart, and that came at a sacrifice. But with the pros of that, chapter 6, for example, can you imagine if I made that chapter with permadeath? What if Dustin and Esther die? Like who's gonna free them? So that's just something I have to keep in mind when I
because especially when you start getting into mid-game maps like 6 or 7 or even some of the later ones like 10, where you're like running around. I think it's 10 where you're running around like it's like the kind of big rectangle map where you're going around. There's the rivers that break and the enemies are at the top and the bottom. That's 9. So 9. when you're doing that, if there was permadeath, it would either be way too difficult or it would just be like a brainless javelin stomp because the enemies would be super weak. They'd have to be.
Exactly.
And yeah, like Viola dying, I would just reset every time. I'm not letting my walking ballista just die.
Exactly. But that's like where it's fun when you have a big cast of characters. Because you're like, what if there's a second ballista user I can use, right? But in a short, like 10 to 15 hour game with 11 playable characters, like there's just no debate for that. Like if Viola dies, you're gonna restart. And that would just get annoying at that point.
And one of the things I think a lot of people love like big casts, even like the Fire Emblem games that have the smallest. I remember I knew at some point which one was the smallest, but it's games like Echoes and I guess by extension Gaiden and Sacred Stones have really small Fire Emblem casts that are still like 2.5 times larger than Grey Heritage's cast. But the thing that jumped out to me that I really enjoyed about this small pool of characters is that everyone feels super distinct. And so was that a focus for you? Was making each character feel really, really distinct?
Yeah, that was definitely the goal. So something I try to kind of like use as a reference, the smallest Fire Emblem cast is Gaiden, and it had 32 characters, so it had 16 for each army, and I only had 11, and I did 11 because it was mostly for budget reasons, because you had to like pay for the character art and all that stuff, and you had to like balance it and things like that. Um, but when you have 11 characters, you could create like a much more polished
Mhm.
experience, right? I get to spend more time with these 11 characters and make them feel unique and special in their own way. While if I had 32 characters, and keep in mind that's the smallest
Mhm.
Fire Emblem cast, you know, there's gonna be duplicates. You know, there's gonna be characters that kind of feel like you know, there's not as much love put into those characters. While in my game, because I had 11 playable characters, I get to spend time tweaking their gameplay to make them feel unique. I get to spend time giving them cutscenes and like give time for you to really like this character and like have their own like personal struggles and things like that. While with 32 characters, especially if I'm like one of the only writers, that's gonna it'll start coming off like, you know, half baked, like undercooked
Mhm.
characters out there.
Yeah, so I think a lot of players miss, and I know this is definitely the case for myself. Miss some of the older Fire Emblem games. And when I'm playing Three Houses or something, I like playing the Game Boy games where the characters are kind of already done for me. Like they're made. Their builds are made. They have a very specific thing that they do, and they do that thing for the most part well, depending on who they are. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I'm just curious about what your process was as a designer when you were approaching, how to make these characters feel unique and also how to make them have the utility that they did, like designing skills, because this is a very skill heavy game.
Yeah. So it's a very skill heavy game because I feel like it adds a lot to the uniqueness of the characters. If I was to compare my game to a Fire Emblem game, it'd probably be the closest to Thracia, where characters come with their skills already. And like you can do like scrolls and stuff in Thracia to gain skills. I did not do that in my game personally because I found that when you're kind of working on a game by yourself and you want to like balance the game and create like a polished experience and such like that, it's a lot harder to make a tight knit experience with a lot of variables kind of flying around that you're not 100% sure about. So I personally went against that, and I kind of went with the more pre-made, like Thracia, Game Boy Advance, Fire Emblem route. But yeah, that and that those are the games that I personally prefer, in terms of skills. Like I'm not the biggest fan of like reclassing or anything like that in the future Fire Emblem games. I will reclass if it makes a unit viable, like Anna to Mage and
Mhm.
Engage, for example. Like that sounds kind of fun, and it provides like the uniqueness to the characters, right? Like you know, I could make Thea into like a DPS unit in Gray Heritage or something, but like
Yeah.
you know, she's a nun, you know, like, and I personally like that individuality of the character a lot. And if I do something like reclassing, you know, like I do agree it's fun, but I also want to make them feel unique in their
Mhm.
own way, you know?
Yeah, and part of that, I think also we've been talking a lot about the characters and how they grow. So they really do grow in like a very linear way. The experience here is very focused on gameplay. You are focused on strategy above all else. You're not ever really concerned with building units. But one little quirk about the game is the EXP gain. Because I'm sure people who've been watching the footage on screen will see, like, you'll get a kill, just a regular dude, and just drop like 60 EXP, which is the exact opposite of Berwick Saga, a game you've been talking about how much you love that game. That's a game where you get basically no experience. Um, why
Yeah.
why did you make the decision to have the EXP yield be really high and to have that consistent feed of level ups?
Yeah. It's mostly to control like the tempo of the chapters. So before a hard chapter, I try to give a lot of EXP the chapter before. So like the more like right, where I guess like the more like basic chapters, right, where you're like routing the enemies or something like that. I try to give a lot of EXP so that you can train like your weaker
Mhm.
units, for example, right? But when the hard chapter pops up, I'm trying to ramp up the difficulty. So that's when the EXP gain is a little bit lower, and like those are meant to be the more memorable
Mhm.
chapters, right? So I'm trying to like prep you up before that chapter
Okay.
start.
Right, that's interesting. I didn't notice that while playing, but I do think that's a fascinating decision to because usually most games just have an EXP formula, but then to actually like kind of manipulate that so you
Mhm.
can control how much experience players get. Um,
Yeah, and something to also keep in mind, it is kind of go back to like the length of the game. Like Berwick Saga is like I want to say like a 40 to 60 hour long game, and then my game is like 10 to 15 hours. So like you're gonna notice that things speed up
yeah,
quicker, you know. But like that's kind of like where you're trying to reach that
yeah.
end game, you know. Like that's how I control the EXP
It's
distributions.
it's all about the dopamine, and it hits a lot. Um,
Yeah. And like that's the thing with like the short games, like you have the ability to do like banger after banger
mhm,
like quickly, you know, and like that's
yeah.
what I was going for.
So, uh, because that was something I'd never thought about. I didn't think about it while playing. This gets us into kind of the last stretch here of what we're going to talk about, which is sort of a wild card for you. What's anything that we didn't talk about that you would like
Uh,
to address?
yeah. So ever since I released the game, a lot of like ROM hackers and like aspiring indie game developers like would PM me and ask for advice and things like that. So I figured I'd give like some generalized advice, so maybe some people in your audience would be interested in knowing about that if they ever want to make their own games, for
Okay.
example. Um, yeah. So when you start off making your game, I do recommend making your game small. And like, trust me, I love genealogy, right? But you know, when you're only one person, it's really hard to make a game like genealogy if you don't have like the budget, the time, or the skill for it. And something I do keep in mind is that, you know, Kaga made like 3 games before genealogy. I think he made like 4 because he made like the NES
Hmm.
Famicom War game. So he made a few games before he made that big game, you know. And like if you look at a lot of game directors, like their big banger hit is usually not their first game. It tends to be like their
Hmm.
5th or their 7th game or something, you know. Like Final Fantasy 7, I think that was like Sakaguchi's like 10th game or something like that. So you know, you kind of like learn to make the small game and then you know how to make the big games afterwards. And by making the small game, you kind of know what like your forte is in your skill set. So like for me, I personally think uh I'm more into like writing and map design. I will say I don't think mechanically my game is not like, you know, 8 engage level combat mechanics, but I lean into my forte and try to create like a memorable experience from it. And you know, you eventually learn what is your forte. Like you kind of know what you're good at and lean towards that. Say if sorry, so say if you are interested in gameplay, you look at the more smaller games to see how you can replicate that. So a good example would probably be like Binding Blade, for example. Like I feel like Binding Blade is one of the more funner gameplay experience that's like a small game that you could kind of like replicate the formula and kind of spin it into your own version. And then if you're more into like writing, I think something like Sacred Stones or Echoes is a good one. Like try to write impactful dialogue. So when you make your game, like you kind of just you learn what
Hmm.
you want to be good at and you lean towards that and you try to make the best experience you can with the skill set you have. And then, you know, eventually maybe you will make the next Genealogy or Radiant Dawn or
Hmm.
Three House, you know?
All right. Well, I think that's all pretty good advice, especially
Yeah.
for young developers. And I know that is a. I know you said you wanted to give advice to this audience, and I know that I've spoken to a lot of people that are aspiring game designers. So I think that's take that advice. Those of you listening.
Yeah. You know, trust me, like it's tempting to make the next genealogy. I would love to make a game like genealogy someday,
Mhm.
personally. But you know, you gotta know how to make the Shadow Dragon and the Binding
Yes.
Blade of Life. You know, you gotta know how to make Mystery of the Emblem. You know, and you know, you work your way up from there. You get a bigger budget. You meet new people to help you along the way. But until then, you gotta learn how to start small
Mhm.
and work your way up.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me today, B Train. And before we go, I'd just like to confirm just where the game is available. Where can people play Grey Heritage? Where can they get it?
Yeah, definitely check out Steam. If that's where the game is usually at. It goes on sale about like once a month. So if you guys want, just wishlist it. Steam will let you know when the game is on discount. That's usually the best way to know when if you want to get the game.
And I know, and I guess you can confirm this for me. Do you know if it's going to be on sale during the whole July sale?
Yes. So we're gonna be on the summer.
Yeah, and
Summer
considering when
festival
this
sale.
video is going to release, that's probably only like a week away for everybody out there. So go ahead, wishlist it, and pick it up.
Yeah, definitely wishlist it. I definitely appreciate it. And then I'm gonna use like the sales from this game, work on the next game, make a even bigger.
Or just
and
pick it
better
up
from
now
there.
because I think this game is worth its full asking price. Personally, I think you get because I think
I
you
really
get, 'cause I
appreciate
believe
it.
it's $15. You get $15 of. You definitely get your $15 worth with this game. It's really good. So, thank you for joining me, B Train. And
Yeah, thank you for having me, man. I love
and
talking
best
to you.
of appreciate that, and best of luck to you on all your future endeavors.